The words hit harder than I expected. Rage boiled beneath my skin while shame burned across my face. Richard Hale didn't whisper it in private. He announced it to the entire executive floor, reducing 20 years of my work to non-essential overhead. My colleagues stared at their notes, too afraid to meet my eyes. He thought he had ended me with a single cut. But arrogance has a way of overlooking fragile seams, and sometimes, one hidden safeguard is enough to tear an empire apart. Can you believe this? Fired on payroll day. Comment if you've ever been humiliated at work, and make sure to subscribe. This story only gets darker. Richard Hale didn't even lower his voice when he struck. The CFO leaned back in his chair, tapped the payroll sheet in front of him, and declared loud enough for the entire executive floor to hear, "As of today, Gail Turner is no longer on the payroll. Non-essential staff have no place in this reform." His words echoed like a verdict. For a moment I thought I had misheard, but the stillness around me confirmed it. Pens froze, eyes darted to the table, no one daring to meet my gaze. 20 years of service erased in a single announcement delivered with smug precision. My breath caught as heat climbed up my neck, the humiliation burning worse than any anger. I had saved this company through more midnight audits and balance sheet crises than Richard could count. Yet here I was, publicly discarded like a broken calculator. He straightened his tie, satisfied, as if this spectacle proved his dominance. My colleagues sat stiff, the silence of compliance more cutting than applause. I gripped my pen so tightly my knuckles ached, grounding myself against the tidal wave of shame. Richard smirked, savoring the theater of it all. He thought power came from humiliation, that silencing me would cement his control. But arrogance has blind spots. And sometimes the smallest oversight, a clause buried in a contract, a single line of compliance code, can become the fracture that splits an entire empire wide open. The humiliation still clung to me when I returned to my office, but beneath the sting, a sharper thought began to take shape. Richard Hale believed cutting me off payroll ended my influence, but he had overlooked the structure that Evelyn Price, Summit Corp's founder, built into this company long before he ever walked through the doors. Years earlier, Evelyn had told me that numbers protect more than profits. They protect people. She was meticulous, drafting compliance systems that punished arrogance disguised as reform. Hidden deep within the corporate bylaws was an audit trigger clause, a mechanism so precise most never even knew it existed. It was designed for a single purpose. If a senior officer unilaterally breached payroll without proper board approval, ownership control would shift. Not to another executive, not to the loudest voice in the room, but to the guardian Evelyn trusted to keep Summit Corp's foundation intact. That guardian was me. I had signed the acknowledgement forms years ago, never imagining they would carry weight, believing them to be ceremonial. Now, the fine print came alive. Richard saw payroll as a lever to assert dominance. But to the system, it was a violation, one that automatically rewrote authority to safeguard against reckless tampering. I sat at my desk, the termination notice still warm in my hand, and felt the balance sheet of power tilt ever so slightly. He thought he had ended my career with a flourish of arrogance. In reality, he had pulled the hidden wire that connected directly to me. No announcement had been made, no one in the executive suite yet realized it, but on the other side of the compliance servers, the filings were already recalibrating. Ownership percentages were shifting, and the numbers now traced their way back to my name. Richard believed he had silenced me. He had no idea he had just handed me the most decisive weapon of all, structural authority hidden in the very system he thought he controlled. And when the time came, it would not be anger that unseated him, but a line of code he never even noticed. The first sign arrived not in a confrontation, but in a notification, a quiet ping on my phone late Saturday night while the city outside slept. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another flood of useless corporate updates. But the subject line froze me. Payroll exception, Clause 7.3 initiated. My pulse quickened as I opened the message. The language was cold, technical, but its meaning was unmistakable. The system had detected Richard Hale's unauthorized action, erasing me from payroll without a board resolution, and in doing so, it triggered Evelyn Price's safeguard. Ownership allocation was being recalculated. What seemed like a routine compliance alert was, in truth, the crack in Richard's foundation. I stared at the screen, the glow reflecting off my desk, feeling both disbelief and clarity settle over me. Richard had no idea. He thought cutting me off payroll was symbolic theater, a way to humiliate me in front of my peers. But in trying to stage his dominance, he had tripped a wire that Evelyn designed for precisely this kind of arrogance. I pulled up the attached ledger and saw my name populate with a number I had never thought possible: 51%. The clause had activated automatically, transferring Evelyn's reserve shares to me as the protective custodian. The transformation was invisible for now, buried in filings, but it was real. I leaned back, my chest tight with the weight of it. This wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was responsibility. One Evelyn must have known would test me. I could almost hear her voice from years ago, warning about executives who mistook authority for invincibility. I scrolled deeper through the documents, heart pounding as I saw the timestamp, 9:47 p.m. Friday, just hours after Richard's spectacle. His arrogance had triggered the process instantly. He was already undermined, though he celebrated his victory as if nothing could touch him. I knew better than to act too quickly. The numbers were still processing, the filings still routing through the compliance chain. If I moved too soon, he might twist it into another performance. Timing mattered more than satisfaction. I closed the laptop and sat in the dim light, every nerve in my body alive with the knowledge of what had just begun. Richard believed his reform agenda had momentum, that by cutting me out, he had silenced resistance. In reality, his hand had pressed the first domino. And now, a chain reaction was forming in the shadows, one he would not see until it was too late. The smallest trigger, a payroll cut meant to humiliate, was already swelling into something far larger, an audit-driven tide that would not just confront him, but sweep away the illusion of control he wrapped himself in. By Monday morning, Richard Hale was strutting through the halls like a man untouchable. He made sure every conversation carried a barb about efficiency and dead weight, never naming me outright, but making it clear who the target had been. His laughter echoed in the break room as he told a group of managers that sometimes cleaning house meant scrubbing away sentimentality. I kept my head down, box of belongings under my arm, each step a test of patience. He thought the silence around him meant consent, but silence has a way of recording itself. That truth arrived in the form of a message from a young analyst I had once mentored. He had been in the room when Richard boasted too freely, his phone recording tucked discreetly beside his notes. Attached was the file, Richard's voice, unmistakable, dripping with contempt as he bragged about cutting me off payroll, calling me a relic, a liability, and finally, with a laugh, proof that loyalty is worthless in business. I replayed the recording twice, the words slicing through me, but with each repetition my anger steadied into something colder. Evidence. He had given me the rope to bind his own arrogance. I knew from years in finance that numbers were not the only thing that could indict a man. Sometimes words weighed heavier than ledgers. Richard had grown reckless, blinded by his short-lived triumph. To him, humiliation was a weapon. To me, it was a mirror, showing just how fragile his dominance really was. I slipped the recording into a secure drive, tucking it alongside the clause filings that already bore my name. 2 pieces of leverage, each born from his own arrogance, waiting for the moment to collide. Richard paraded confidence, but the first crack was already there, splintering beneath his feet. He just hadn't heard it yet. The first whispers reached me before noon on Tuesday. A colleague from compliance, one of the few who dared to send me a discreet text, wrote only 6 words. Filings show changes. Board is nervous. I stared at the message, pulse racing. The system had moved faster than even I expected. Richard Hale, meanwhile, was still basking in the glow of his so-called reform, making rounds with department heads, issuing sweeping statements about a new, leaner Summit Corp. He had no idea that beneath his feet the foundation was shifting grain by grain. By mid-afternoon, the murmurs grew louder. Directors began calling their assistants with questions about ownership updates and unexpected allocations. One executive told me later that the boardroom itself felt colder, uneasy, as if the walls knew before the men inside did. Richard sensed the discomfort but mistook it for resistance to change, doubling down with harsher pronouncements. He ordered further cuts, warning that sentimentality would no longer protect anyone. His words traveled like smoke through the corridors, leaving employees tense, whispering behind closed doors. The irony was sharp. His effort to project control only highlighted his desperation. I stayed quiet, watching from a distance, but every message that arrived on my phone confirmed the chain reaction was underway. Ownership records were updating in government databases, notices were surfacing in back-office systems, and even junior staff were beginning to wonder who the mysterious new investor might be. Richard mocked the speculation, telling one gathering that real power never hides, a phrase that drew uneasy chuckles but no real laughter. He didn't see the glances exchanged across the room, or perhaps he chose not to. The truth was spreading too quickly to contain. By Wednesday, a director who had long been neutral stopped by my office with a hesitant look. He didn't speak of loyalty or justice. He only asked if I was prepared for what was coming. His tone told me everything. Richard's performance was unraveling, and the board was searching for an anchor. I gave no answer, only a measured nod, but inside my resolve hardened. This was not about spectacle. It was about letting arrogance expose itself fully before the fall. Each rumor, each flicker of doubt, was another fracture widening across Richard's facade. He had built his dominance on humiliation and bravado, but neither could withstand the quiet certainty of numbers. The ownership filings were already public record, even if he hadn't noticed yet. The spread was irreversible. The chain reaction had left his hands the moment he pressed that payroll button. He believed he was tightening his grip on Summit Corp, when in truth the company was slipping through his fingers, drawn inexorably toward the one safeguard he never knew existed. And when the chain reached its final link, there would be no room left for denial. Thursday morning broke with a chill that seeped even through the glass towers of Summit Corp. I arrived not as an employee but as something Richard Hale could not yet imagine, majority shareholder, though the boardroom didn't know it either. The emergency audit had been called to address payroll irregularities, Richard's term for what he thought was a small rebellion to be crushed quickly. He strode into the audit suite with his usual swagger, clutching a folder thick with charts that supposedly proved his efficiency reforms were necessary. He wasted no time standing at the head of the table and declaring that non-essential staff had already been trimmed and more cuts were coming. The words tasted of arrogance, and for a moment I let them settle across the room. Directors sat stiff, some nodding politely, others shifting uncomfortably. Richard mistook silence for compliance, as always. He launched into his presentation, flipping slides of graphs that showed cost savings, as though numbers alone could erase the human cost. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice echoing. "Summit Corp must shed its outdated practices. We cannot afford relics from another era slowing us down." My name wasn't spoken, but every person knew who the relic was meant to be. He tapped the folder with a triumphant smirk, convinced that humiliation delivered days earlier had cleared his path. Then the door opened. The secretary, pale and breathless, stepped inside with a phone in her hand. She whispered something to the chairman, who frowned and passed the device down the line. One by one, directors read the screen, their brows furrowed, eyes flicked toward me at the far end of the room where I had just entered. Richard noticed the shift in atmosphere but plowed ahead, voice rising to cover the unease. "These filings," he insisted, waving his papers, "prove that the board fully supports my vision." Yet the filings he clutched were already outdated. The real ones, the ones lighting up every director's device, told a different story. As of Tuesday, 51% of Summit Corp's shares were registered to me. Evelyn Price's safeguard had activated, and the system had recorded it in permanent ink. I walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, the silver pen Evelyn once gave me glinting in my hand. Richard froze mid-sentence, his mask slipping for the first time. The room hushed so completely I could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. I did not rush. I let silence do what arrogance never could: command attention. Finally, I reached the chair at the far end, the one marked majority shareholder. I did not sit immediately. Instead, I placed Richard's own manila envelope, the one that carried my payroll termination, onto the polished table. Its edges were worn now, but it was a reminder of his arrogance. Then I spoke, calm and steady. "I do not accept the decision to terminate my employment," I said, my voice even but cutting through the air sharper than any shout. Richard's face flushed crimson. "This is absurd," he barked, his words shaking. "She was dismissed under my authority." "She has no standing here." I let the silence stretch again before answering. "Your authority ends where ownership begins." The words hung like frost, unyielding. A director leaned back, arms crossed, and nodded. Another followed, murmuring, "For the record, I vote with Turner." The dam cracked, and one by one, the dominoes fell. Richard's eyes darted, desperate for support, but none came. I slid the silver pen across the table, the same pen Evelyn had used to sign Summit Corp into existence. "This pen," I said softly, "isn't just ink. It is continuity. It is the will of this company's founder. And it proves that Summit Corp does not belong to arrogance." I signed the ownership acknowledgement with a stroke that echoed like thunder in the stillness. The board exhaled as if a storm had finally broken. One director clapped softly, others followed, the sound swelling in relief rather than celebration. Richard sank into his chair, the swagger gone, his power dissolved not by fury, but by the quiet precision of a safeguard he never imagined. I leaned forward, my voice level. "From this moment, Richard, you report directly to me." The collapse was complete. Not with shouts, not with chaos, but with the steady inevitability of a structure undone by its own flaw. And all it took was a single overlooked detail. The boardroom held the weight of silence after my words settled. Richard Hale sat stiff, his knuckles white against the edge of the table, eyes darting for allies that no longer existed. One by one, directors shifted their gaze from him to me, the decision already made without a vote. The tide had turned not through speeches or spectacle, but through the steady proof that numbers never lie. I watched as Richard's face drained of its fire, his bravado extinguished under the cold truth of ownership. The man who once strutted through hallways reveling in humiliation now looked like a shadow trying to cling to walls that no longer supported him. The chairman finally broke the silence, his voice level but heavy. "For the record, Summit Corp recognizes Gail Turner as majority shareholder effective immediately." The words were formal, procedural, but the relief that swept across the room was almost visible. Shoulders loosened, pens tapped again, and a few directors even allowed themselves small, weary smiles. Justice had arrived not with chaos, but with certainty. Richard attempted one last protest, muttering about errors in filings, but his voice cracked under its own weakness. No one bothered to answer. He had been reduced to background noise in a room that no longer acknowledged his authority. I gathered my papers slowly, the silver pen slipping back into my pocket, a quiet reminder of Evelyn Price's foresight. Around me, the tension that had gripped the board dissolved into something calmer, steadier. For the first time in days, I felt not humiliation but clarity. Richard had built his power on spectacle, and spectacle is fragile. I had reclaimed mine through structure, and structure endures. The aftermath was not loud. It was simply the recognition that arrogance had collapsed under its own weight. When the meeting adjourned, I didn't rush to celebrate. The applause had faded quickly, replaced by the quiet shuffling of papers and the low murmur of directors recalibrating their loyalties. That was the truth of corporate life. Power shifted not with cheers but with signatures. I stood at the far end of the table, my chair now marked with the weight of majority ownership, and let the silence settle into me. Richard Hale slipped out quietly, his shoulders hunched, the swagger gone. I didn't watch him leave. His collapse wasn't the victory I carried with me. What mattered was the proof that arrogance always leaves blind spots, and those blind spots are where justice finds its way through. As I gathered the documents, my fingers brushed the silver pen Evelyn Price had placed in my hand years earlier. She must have known this day might come, that one act of hubris could destabilize an empire. I had always thought loyalty was my greatest strength. But now I understood it was preparation, the unseen safeguards, the patience to let arrogance expose itself, that truly turned the tide. Leaving the boardroom, I walked through corridors that only days before had felt hostile, heavy with pitying stares. Now the silence carried a different weight, acknowledgement, even respect. Some averted their eyes still, afraid to be seen aligning too quickly, but others met my gaze with quiet nods. They knew the company's foundation had shifted. My steps were steady, not triumphant. This was not about revenge through destruction. It was about balance restored, a reminder that integrity still mattered in a world eager to discard it. I had been erased from payroll on Friday. By Thursday, the system itself had carried me back in with more authority than Richard could ever command. That irony wasn't loud, but it was perfect. The lesson was clear. In corporate power games, one overlooked detail can collapse the showmanship of the mighty. And sometimes, justice doesn't roar. It arrives quietly, signed in ink, leaving arrogance to crumble under its own weight. I didn't just lose a paycheck that day. I saw firsthand how arrogance can weaken a system from the inside. Richard Hale thought he was untouchable. By cutting me off payroll, he believed he had staged the ultimate act of control. But arrogance always leaves a trail of cracks, and Summit Corp's founder had built-in safeguards precisely for that kind of abuse. The audit clause was invisible until triggered, yet it carried the full weight of ownership. That's the truth about corporate power. It often looks indestructible, but it's only as strong as its weakest blind spot. This lesson matters in today's American corporate world because companies are filled with leaders who confuse dominance with stability. They make decisions for show, without respecting the structure that protects the organization. When those cracks spread, they don't just expose one bad actor, they expose the fragility of the entire system. You should feel validated if you've ever been dismissed, silenced, or overlooked. Arrogance thrives on humiliation, but this story proves that even quiet safeguards can turn humiliation into justice. The practical takeaway is simple. Arrogance is unsustainable. Document risks, understand the rules, and never underestimate the power of a small overlooked clause, a recorded comment, or an ignored safeguard. Those tiny details can grow into the force that collapses a false empire. How to get started today. Document decisions that seem reckless or unfair. Paper trails matter. Learn the hidden safeguards in your system. Contracts, bylaws, compliance rules. Pay attention to minor risks. They often carry the seeds of collapse. Stay patient. Timing can be more powerful than anger. If you've ever witnessed arrogance collapse under its own weight, share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because these lessons of quiet justice deserve to be heard.